Hi everyone, I'm Anvesha and I'm a counseling psychologist. Welcome back to my channel, and if you're new here, then welcome to my channel Psyche Bubbles. So what are some of the most common things that we are expected to use when we are dealing with things like maybe feeling depressed or feeling anxious or stressed out, sad? Well, for a lot of us, it would be coping strategies. Now, coping strategies are not something magical that will solve our problems entirely. A lot of times we will have to sit through and understand where that issue is coming from or why we are experiencing these issues. So we'll try to find the root cause of it. But coping strategies can be pretty helpful if we use them in a balanced way. And I'll talk a little more about it in today's video. In my last video, I had spoken about how when we are anxious or we might have anxiety disorders, how avoidance becomes the easier way out. And I had briefly also addressed about coping skills and how there are different coping strategies that we can use in our day-to-day lives. So in this video, we'll try to understand what coping strategies are, the common types of coping strategies, and also how some psychologists have categorized coping strategies into different groups. At the end, maybe we can come up with a balanced outlook or balanced approach to using coping skills for ourselves. Okay, so what are coping skills? According to the American Psychological Association's dictionary, coping skills are simply ways that we can behave or think that would help us reduce unpleasant emotions like stress or anxiety or maybe just feeling overwhelmed or sad. So, coping strategies can be conscious ways that we can minimize feeling these emotions, and sometimes it can also include distractions. So when many of us think about coping strategies, we may think about things like journaling or maybe breathing techniques. Some of us may think about regular exercises or going to the gym in general as coping strategies as well. And yes, they are some of the common types of coping skills, but they are not the only kind. At the same time, there might be some of us who might use substance or any other forms of distraction to cope with a particular situation that's very unpleasant. So let's first try to understand the two common types of coping strategies. But before we do that, let us try an activity. If you can take out a sheet of paper or you can use your phone and list down all the different coping strategies that you have found yourself using throughout your life. They can be anything, and just simply note them down. We'll try to come back to this list later on. Okay, so two of the most common types of coping strategies that we know of are generally healthy and unhealthy coping skills. So healthy coping mechanisms are also called adaptive coping mechanisms. Why? Because it helps us adjust to the situation at hand, and we try to find a solution to the problems that we are going through and also what we are feeling in that moment so that we can come out of it. On the other hand, unhealthy coping mechanisms are also called maladaptive coping mechanisms. Why? Because it doesn't really address the issue at hand at all. In fact, it involves ways we can distract ourselves or avoid finding any resolution to the problem. And in turn, it keeps us in that stressful situation longer. So while it gives us a short-term relief, it doesn't really help us get out of the situation as such at all. The thing is, a lot of times there can be quote-unquote healthy coping mechanisms that we use, like let's say journaling or let's say breathing techniques or even exercising, that are actually helpful for us. But if we continue to use them to simply distract ourselves from addressing our problems or addressing the issues, then they also can become unhealthy. So put it simply, what differentiates between a healthy coping style and an unhealthy coping style is for how long are we avoiding the issue at hand and how long are we staying in that upsetting situation and not getting out of it for whatever reason. This is once again to say that when we are using any coping skill, we are at the end of the day trying to survive through something unpleasant, something that might be stressful or anxiety inducing. So even if we use avoidance or anything like substance abuse, it's not really coming from a place of us wanting to keep ourselves in this stressful situation, but it's important to remember that when we are using any coping skill, at the end of the day we want to deal with the problem at hand, or we want to not feel the anxiety, or we don't want to feel that sense of overwhelm. So speaking of healthy and unhealthy coping mechanisms, these are the common types as we see it, but different psychologists have arranged the coping skills or strategies into categories as well. And research is still developing. There are more and more psychologists who are showing interest in trying to understand the different categories. For the sake of this video, I'll list down some of them and maybe we'll discuss them a little bit. So if we look at the broadest categories, it would be voluntary and involuntary coping mechanism. Then it would be approach-based coping mechanisms and avoidance-based coping mechanism. And then if we had to be a little more specific, we have problem-focused coping mechanisms, emotion-focused coping mechanisms, meaning-making coping mechanisms, and also religious or spiritual coping mechanisms. So then what are involuntary and voluntary coping mechanisms? Because this is a broad category, it basically means that these are the strategies that we either use consciously to solve our problems or the strategies that we end up using on an autopilot. For many people who have gone through stress for a long period of time, or maybe they are anxious for many years, there are times we might adopt things like negative self-talk or self-blame to deal with these problems. Now, they don't really find immediate or actual solutions to the issues at hand, but they make us feel like we are holding ourselves responsible. We are doing something about it. We are acknowledging the problem at hand. But it can be almost an illusion. And that's where sometimes voluntary coping mechanisms can help us solve the problem. Now, these are conscious steps we take to help us deal with the situation so that we don't continue feeling stressed out or anxious. Then we move on to approach and avoidance-based coping mechanism. Now, avoidance-based strategies are things I have spoken about a little bit in our previous video, but to put it simply, when we are avoiding a situation, we are distancing ourselves from the problem. So it brings some form of immediate comfort, but in the long run, it can continue bringing in that stressful situation in our life again and again. On the other hand, approach-based coping styles are, as the name suggests, ways that we can address the situation head-on and then find a solution for it. With that being said though, there are times where avoidance-based coping skills can be helpful, especially if the situation is dangerous and approaching the problem might actually not help us out at all. But in general, when we are approaching an issue at hand and we are trying to find a resolution to it, it helps us get over that problem sooner. Now, let's look at some of the specific coping styles. So when we look at problem-focused coping mechanism, it's, as the name suggests, a way for us to look at the situation as a problem and then trying to solve it. I've spoken to people who naturally gravitate towards problem-focused coping styles in the sense that, let's say they have an issue at hand, like when there's job loss, then they will immediately sit down to strategize what their next steps could be and then trying to find solutions around it so that it is solved as soon as possible. And then they will not really end up feeling as stressed out as before. For some others, they gravitate a lot more towards what is called emotion-focused coping styles. So they first address their stress that they're currently feeling. So maybe they will practice things like breathing techniques, or they might journal about their thoughts and emotions a little. Sometimes they seek support from family and friends so that they can handle their stress better. There are also people who use meaning-making coping styles. Now, this is not as well researched. Generally speaking, psychologists see it as a way for us to understand the problem at hand. So if we look at job loss, a person who uses meaning-making coping mechanisms, they may sit down and try to understand what are the reasons this happened. They may try to understand what it means for them and what their future might look like and what changes they might have to do in their life. So they're trying to understand the overall meaning of the situation. And then we have spiritual or religious coping mechanisms. Now this is a lot more personal, and many people might not see this coping style as objective or even scientific. But when we look at religious or spiritual coping mechanisms, it's important for us to understand it as a way for people to not shoulder the stress as much as possible. There are times where people may use this coping style to not blame themselves. And what that does is it helps some people to find solution, it calms them down, and so they'll go into problem solving mode easier versus someone who uses a lot of self-blame. Now, once again, since this is a more personal style of coping, in the sense that there may be people who are religious who naturally gravitate towards this coping style versus some others who don't. So it depends from person to person how that is used. While it can help a lot with having a more positive outlook, like with some people, they might think that there is a reason that they're going through something like this. It can become dangerous, it can have negative consequences when people either stop taking personal responsibilities or people start blaming each other or even the higher power for whatever problem they're going through. So there may be times where people may say that whatever is happening is for the good, but they're not taking any personal responsibilities to change the situation at hand. Or sometimes they just feel anger towards an invisible energy or power, and they do not make any effort to change their circumstances in their life. And these are extreme situations where it does more harm than good. But generally speaking, feeling a sense of hope or feeling like there's someone looking out for you can help a lot of people navigate difficult parts of their life a lot better. So, when we look at coping strategies, one of the key things to identify is what are the kind of coping strategies we gravitate towards. We can all look back at our life and realize that we have used different styles of coping in some way or the other. So here's where the list comes in. Maybe you can look through the list of all the coping mechanisms that you have used throughout your life and see which style of coping do you gravitate towards more. If you find yourself gravitating towards one of the coping styles more than others, here's what we can try doing. Many researchers look at how we cope through problems and find that what is very important for us to overcome any form of adversity is to use some form of flexibility. Let's say if I use emotion-focused coping style, where when I'm calm, I can handle any situation. So maybe I'll focus on breathing techniques, or maybe I'll focus on journaling my thoughts. But if I find that this is not really helping me out at all, then my problems are not really being solved because I still can't find ways to handle the situation, then flexibility would be maybe using things like meaning-making coping, or maybe sitting down and strategizing something that will help me solve the problem. So I'm using different styles and being flexible with how I cope with the problems that I'm facing in my life. So when you look at your list, find ourselves using one coping style more than other, here is a strategy that we can use to balance how we cope with a given problem. First is we try to address what the problem is at hand. So if we look at maybe job loss as a problem, we can list that down and we can notice what is the coping style we use most often. And then we try to introduce different coping skills to balance it out. Balanced coping approach would look somewhat like the problem at hand. We try to understand where that problem is coming from. Then we try to understand how we feel about it and what can we do about it to solve it. So we are incorporating pretty much the emotion-focused coping mechanisms, problem-focused coping mechanisms, and meaning-making coping mechanism. Now you can include spiritual or religious coping mechanisms within emotion-focused coping mechanisms as well. What that does is it helps us balance our approach a lot more, because we generally do tend to gravitate towards one style of coping more than others. So this is all for today's video. I hope you liked it, and if you did, feel free to like, share and subscribe to the channel. Comment about the different coping strategies that you might have used, and feel free to share what your balanced coping strategy looks like in the comment section down below if you are comfortable. For today, that is all. I'll see you next time with another new video. Bye!